I swear to be the light in the dark, the sun's reflection where it does not shine. I will defend the weak with my might, bring faith to the hopeless, and knowledge to the ignorant. Where others falter, I will find my resolve. By my honor, my sword, and the light of the moon, I pledge my life in service to the Queen, country, and gods. The Oath of a Knight from the Order of the Moon. Welcome back to the Atnia In-Depth series, where we talk about a specific thing within Atnia, the world of our tabletop RPG and card game. I'm Ski, and I'm here with Kjavin.
This episode, we're going to focus on the Knights of Redemption, which sort of exists as a natural foil to the Old Watch, the culture we discussed in our last episode. Whereas the Old Watch was this sort of jealously guarded peasant democracy where it's ruled by the workers. The Knights of Redemption have aspirations of putting back together the old kingdom of Atnia. They're ruled by the great Queen Eudoxia, and the society is centered around powerful knights who wield a mix of magic and martial prowess to protect their peasants.
Yes, and sort of the whole thing with the Old Watch was, as mentioned, they were this kind of peasant democracy. And here there are these nobles and knights, which the knights kind of are synonymous with the nobles at this point. Kind of the idealized version of nobility here is that the nobles are existing to serve the peasants in a sense where they have power, but they are kind of in their positions because they have sworn their lives to protecting Pax Nova, their home.
Right, and this is more or less true depending on the person, and we're kind of going to cover the knightly orders later on and how exactly they live up to, or in some cases don't live up to those ideals, but it certainly is more true than sort of that knightly mythos before the apocalypse, that there really is this kind of culture of honor and protection after the world has fallen. The main sort of core belief in the Knights of Redemption is that knights have sworn themselves to protect peasants and they should be afforded additional rights, privileges, and say, because of their nobility and because they're choosing to self-sacrifice for society is kind of the belief at the heart of this society. So I guess jumping right into it, we should maybe talk a little bit about the history of Pax Nova and how the Knights of Redemption came to be what they are. And the Knights of Redemption are really centered around three great heroic figures that kind of inspire this knightly culture and culture of sort of heroism and honor that comes afterwards. So the first is Queen Eudoxia, who was back in the day before the apocalypse known as Saint Eudoxia. She was a high-up member within the Church of the Veriglass. The bold warrior Gacht, and the wizard Esmond Pater. Now, the three of them were kind of embroiled in their own political drama before the apocalypse. Eudoxia was almost a sort of Joan of Arc-like figure who is renowned among the common folk of the church, but she was almost threatening to cause a schism because of some of her blasphemous ideas and beliefs, or at least what the church considered to be blasphemous. She wanted major figures within the church who were currently recognized as like angels and things to be recognized as full gods unto themselves, which was sort of a split from where the church currently believed in things. And her husband Esmond and her friend Gacht both kind of like worked with her throughout this, and again, there was a sort of a schism embroiled in the church when all of a sudden the magical apocalypse occurs and everything changes. And the three of them basically manage to gather up what survivors they can and forge a path to the mountains where they use their powerful magics to basically create this palace out of nowhere and use it as a bastion to start protecting those survivors that they can.
Yeah, so kind of a recurring theme with the Knights of Redemption is they are very powerful. So the knights, they are able to wield both divine and arcane magic, but they take a long time to train. So there's not a huge amount of them, but the ones that do exist are usually fairly dedicated and able to sort of protect areas on their own.
Yeah, exactly. And this is kind of exemplified by these main initial leaders. So it's just like essentially three people protecting a large number of civilians at the beginning. And eventually they start to fall one by one at different points throughout history. Gacht and Esmond die, but it's been 80 years and Eudoxia is actually still alive, seemingly kept alive by some divine power, allowing her to protect her people on for the years.
So how old is Eudoxia now?
Eudoxia would be around like 120 years old at kind of the current moment in time. I think she's 40 or so around the time of the apocalypse, and 80 more years have passed.
Yeah, and to be clear, this is not really a normal thing that happens, so definitely some kind of magic going on there.
Yeah, Eudoxia is a human, and it's not completely unheard of for humans to live this long. Like, when we talk about the Archmages later, they've also lived an incredible amount of time, but for humans to live that amount of time, it takes some kind of magical intervention. The only species that lives longer are, like, ogres. So Eudoxia is the de facto queen of Atnia. She technically was related to the noble line, but was sort of a distant cousin of the king and queen at the time, who were now presumed dead. So she sort of leads the Knights of Redemption in this tenuous place where people are still looking for a more appropriate heir to put on the throne. After they had gained their initial sort of foothold, what the Knights of Redemption ended up doing was fighting and using their limited resources of knights to protect a wider range of farmland. They've also constructed arcane towers to deal with some of the monsters and protect their farmland without actually having to send knights everywhere. So what they've done to deal with their small population of defenders is they've essentially constructed towers that have these arcane beacons at the top that charge up energy over time from the power of the rift hanging over everything. And these monsters are drawn to feed on the energy, so they find their way into these towers. The towers are kind of constructed like mazes, where once monsters approach looking to feed on the arcane energy at the top of the tower, they're sort of led in this circuitous route up a staircase, and over time, the tower charges up more energy and eventually discharges it, killing most things inside. It's not a perfect solution to monsters in the territory, but it does help them to keep their farmland safe without stretching their knights even more thin.
So what happens when the monsters do survive the arcane blast within the tower? Do they kind of get mad and go off and maybe eat some farmers, or do they just still hang out then there waiting for more energy?
If they do survive the blast, they'll probably end up consuming the tower itself. That's likely a very powerful monster in order to survive it, which will need to be dealt with by knights. And so yes, they'll end up probably incurring in, and once a tower breaks, more monsters might come through. And so usually what happens is when the farmers notice this or there's advanced warning, pretty much everyone flees back to the palace, where knights will actually have to come out and fight this incursion back and reconstruct the defense towers.
Interesting. So they're kind of playing a whole tower defense game here.
Yeah, a little bit, with, again, these sort of very limited resources and troops in comparison to how much farmland they need to defend.
Look forward to Atnia tower defense game with the Knights of Redemption.
Yeah, sure. Something to be designed in the future eventually. So yeah, that kind of covers the basic history of the Knights of Redemption. They're still sort of locked in this deadlock. They have this contrast between knights and peasants. Social mobility is easier than it was before the apocalypse, because basically anyone willing to swear themselves to these knightly oaths and undergo the training is accepted in the nobility now, which wasn't always the case before the apocalypse. And it's sort of a constitutional monarchy, much like Atnia was before everything collapsed. So peasants do get somewhat of a say, but knights get more say, where there's kind of this court and knights make decisions. Technically, you have executive power vested in the queen. However, she normally doesn't contradict the factions or what's going on in court, because she also sort of has her own limited political constraints.
So how dangerous exactly is it for the peasants who are just kind of on the farmland around the city of Pax Nova? Is this like a better or worse situation than, for example, being within the walls of the Old Watch?
Probably a slightly worse situation than being in the walls of the Old Watch, sort of, except every peasant is actually afforded, like, kind of stronger political rights than non-citizens are in the Old Watch. So there's kind of upsides and downsides, but it is more dangerous, I think, than being within the outer walls of the Old Watch.
When the monsters are kind of roaming around towards the towers, do they ever like just kind of veer off course and eat somebody?
Yeah, potentially if you're near the towers, but the towers are usually structured like sort of further away from the farmland, so the farmer themselves would have to be kind of wandering a little bit off the beaten path to end up in that situation. Not that that doesn't happen, though.
Sure, so the towers are just kind of mostly doing their job of drawing the monsters towards them, but sometimes it might be a situation where it goes wrong.
And this is kind of skipping ahead into some of the orders of knights, but because of the danger to some of the farmland, some peasants have sworn themselves to a minor order of knights that they've kind of made themselves called the Order of Wheat, where some of the peasants sort of on these border territory have trained themselves to become knights and protect their farms and help people to evacuate in situations of danger.
Yeah, I guess we'll learn what, if any, kind of magic they have there when we get to that.
Yep.
So I believe next up would be the sort of city itself and the extended lands around it, or is that what we already went over?
Kind of what we were talking about, although it's worth addressing a little bit more of the city itself and its sort of presence on the lake. So the city was sort of conjured up from the ground via magic, and a lake was formed around it to serve as a moat. There's a single stone bridge that crosses to the city itself, which allows it to be highly defensible by the order of knights that guards it. And this is, again, kind of doing things a little out of order, but one of the knightly orders is called the Order of the Lake, which is designed entirely around defense of this city. That's kind of their single major role. And so they incorporate little bits of divine magic, worshipping the god of calamity, Vosteron. They're all about sort of drawing their foe in to difficult situations where they can then surround and sort of envelop and destroy whoever is attempting to invade.
And are there orders of knights that will be sort of going far away from Paxov, or do they all kind of hang out in this general sort of civilization or community?
Yeah, there are plenty of orders of knights around different things. So I guess it's time to jump in and start talking about the orders. The order of knights, or the major order that's most likely to leave Pax Nova, is the Order of the Torch, which is the one kind of founded in Gacht, the orc hero that helped found the civilization's honor. He died was the first of the three of them to die, defending the bridge a long time ago. But he worshipped the orcish god Zagagir, and this was actually part of the tension that was starting to lead to the church schism, is orc gods, or a lot of orc gods, were originally mortals, and the Church of the Veriglass believed that mortals could never become full gods, they could only ascend to angels. And Eudoxie was basically advocating that her friend's god or angel, it's sort of a contentious topic within the Knights of Redemption, be recognized as a god. So the Order of the Torch officially sort of worships the forge god Brag, but a lot of them actually worship this orcish god Zagagir, and there's a bit of sort of political tension with the other orders over this. And they're all about sort of heroism and adventure and going and exploring sort of the dungeons all over Atnia and bringing back boons for their people.
Yeah, so Zagagir is one of the orc gods, and the thing about the orc gods is they're essentially always mortals who have, in the mythology, ascended to godhood in some way, which is sort of in conflict with the Veriglass Church, which is sort of the main church of Atnia, who basically doesn't recognize this idea. And Zagagir was this figure which essentially was within an army, and the leaders of the army kind of sucked. Zagagir was like, okay, well, I'm just going to do this myself, and I'm going to prove you wrong, and I'm probably going to die doing it, but I don't care, you're wrong. And he sort of went and killed this, like, huge monster or something, won the entire war, and ascended to godhood in that way. And this is one of the gods that the Order of the Torch is worshipping.
Yeah, and Zagagir became, like, sort of known as this god of heroism and trickery. Like, the leaders of his army gave him several impossible tasks that he managed to accomplish in, like, various humorous and kind of silly ways before eventually he was sent off to his death to go and slay a dragon by some tellings of the story. He also is kind of a god of storytelling, because part of sort of his lore is that the story is told differently each time, and sort of the teller makes their own Zagagir as sort of their version of an ideal hero.
So sort of some connections to oral traditions and storytelling.
Yeah, so and so this culture is sort of carried on within the Order of the Torch, even though officially they have to sort of worship Veriglass gods because of this sort of compromise of structures that exists right now between the various knightly orders, which I guess is worth going into what the more conservative orders are like next.
Sure.
So the Order of the Sun worships the god Ozin and is sort of the most about reinforcing the old lines of nobility. And they, in particular, are some of the ones most responsible for trying to send people off on quests to try and find people closer to the original noble lines than Eudoxia to eventually maybe kind of depose her. And they also have the most sort of like high nobles actually inherited in their own blood. They're often sort of opposed to knighting all of these peasants, which is currently happening in the Knights of Redemption, but they also sort of understand the necessity of it and having more trained soldiers. So there's a bit of a back and forth there. Next, alongside sort of the conservative faction, is the Order of the Coin, which in some ways is opposed to, in some ways sort of allied with the Order of the Sun. The Order of the Coin worships Olm, sort of the god of death and commerce in this world, and they were actually originally a peasant faction, which is where they sort of fall counter to the Order of the Sun, but they were a peasant faction that almost bought their way into nobility through having a lot of resources and wealth after the apocalypse. And they keep a lot of the economics of Pax Nova running, which naturally sort of puts them in line with the conservative factions a lot of the time, even though the Order of the Sun, which is more sort of about this blood nobility structure, kind of dislikes them. The final sort of faction that falls cleanly on the conservative camp is the Order of the Poppy. They are kind of the most like classic romantic knights. They are often duelists, and they represent this image of like very honorable one-on-one combat, sweep you off your feet with a rose kind of knighthood. They fall alongside the conservative faction, but I think are less sort of politically aware than the other two political factions a lot of the time. But the politically aware among them often wield sort of the social convention of dueling and court to political advantage.
Yeah, so these different orders of knights, do they have different duties within the whole kingdom here, or are they mostly working together within different things and just as these sort of little subgroups that are dispatched out to protect areas?
Different duties, and basically they're all sort of controlled within their own structure. So each order of knights is going to have its own hierarchy, its own training, and so for example, like the Order of the Torch is like less magically inclined, and they're more just like straight combat inclined. The Order of the Sun, actually a lot of members of the Order of the Sun are not combat inclined at all and are just diplomats. And same with the Order of the Coin being like more populated by traders. So it kind of depends on the individual faction, how they're trained and the role that they play. The orders are not like cleanly sort of locked into a particular role, with the exception of the Order of the Lake, which is specifically sworn to defend the city. A lot of the time, for example, like the Order of the Sun is mostly filled by sort of diplomats that do things in court, but some of them might choose to be adventurers and go off on quests similar to the Order of the Torch. So we've already talked a little bit about the Order of the Lake, which defends the city. The Order of the Book is the one that is sort of built in the memory of Esmond Pater, Eudoxia's late husband, and sort of the wizard of the original group, and it's the most like sort of arcane magically inclined of the knightly orders. And they also sort of represent the scholars of the Knights of Redemption. The Order of the Book mostly maintains the archives within the Knights of Redemption. They're the ones in charge of sort of like managing all of these historical records, and they're often work closely with the Knights of the Torch in order to go and pull in ancient knowledge from the Alva or from the ruins elsewhere so that they can expand their base of knowledge. In that way, they almost have a tenuous alliance with the Order of the Sun, who wants records of historical nobility to find someone to depose Eudoxia, but the Order of the Book often ends up being a little bit more within Eudoxia's faction, so there's some tension there. So the next major order to talk about is the Order of the Mirror, which is the intentionally sort of politically centrist faction. They worship the god Tata, this goddess of like correspondence and connection between things, and they intentionally sort of strive to, whenever the court is leaning a particular way, balance it in the other direction. They also train their knights with a similar philosophy to be sort of fluid and fill whatever role is missing. And then finally, there's the Order of the Moon, which is Eudoxia's own order of knights, and they're some of the most highly trained of any of the orders. Eudoxia, after her husband's death, started taking on some of his knowledge and learning wizardly magic in addition to divine magic, and the Order of the Moon follows in this tradition, practicing martial combat ability as well as both divine and arcane magic to sort of combine for very powerful and unique effects that can enhance one another and cover for each other's weaknesses. with, of course, the downside being it takes years and years to train even a single knight from this order. In addition to these major knightly orders that sort of form the bulk of the factions in the court of Pax Nova, there are also tons of minor knightly orders, because anyone who sort of swears this selfless oath gets accepted into the nobility of Pax Nova these days. So, for example, as we already talked about, the Order of the Wheat, an order of farmers that basically choose to swear themselves as knights, but to not swear themselves as full nobility, to swear themselves as sort of like knights and farmers first, and protect their own farmland. In general, they're not trained in magic and just kind of learn basic combat abilities in Pax Nova before returning to be farmers on their own farm, but just with the capacity of protecting the people around them. Another sort of larger one of these minor orders is the Order of the Ring, which is focused on promises, connections, and marriage within society. And again, there are just many, many more of these, and anyone who swears themselves as knights is welcome. As we've kind of mentioned in the Old Watch video, the Knights on the Wall are considered an official knightly order in Pax Nova that would have a seat in the court if they wish to send anyone there.
So can any old group just like make an unofficial knightly order and just be like, we're the order of making cool watermelons that we give to everybody? I don't know.
Probably to some extent, but it would have to be seen as some kind of self-sacrificing, selfless, and good act by the other orders of knights for it to be considered an official knightly order by them. So they would probably like vet your oath and vote on it in their court if they found another knightly order.
I suppose then we should move on to the Knights of Redemption's perspectives on the other factions within Atnia that they might be in contact with, starting with the Old Watch, which we already talked about in our previous episodes, so maybe we won't go super in-depth here, but perhaps give us the other side of the coin here.
Yeah, the other side of the coin is basically that the Knights of Redemption view the Old Watch as very similar to them. I think they're less opposed to the Old Watch than the Old Watch would be to them, especially since they are protected by this knightly order that has nobly sworn to defend their walls. They would rather treat and deal with the Knights of the Wall than they would the peasant government of the Old Watch, but they see the peasants as legitimate peasants of the land carrying on in the legal traditions of Atnia. Even if they disagree with the peasants being in charge, their knights have chosen to allow this to happen, and so this is kind of fine and acceptable for the Knights of Redemption. They'd be pretty happy to work with the Old Watch, though again, they'd be more inclined to treat with the knights than they would the peasant government.
And next up would be the Salt Alliance, which, as a reminder, the Salt Alliance is sort of this group of resistance fighters before the apocalypse, and since then has sort of grown and become a bit less actively persecuted by the old Atnian government, but the world is in general more dangerous, so. Now, the Knights of Redemption being sort of this continuation of the Atnian government, are they more chill with the Salt Alliance now, or how does that work out?
No, the Salt Alliance would be seen primarily as terrorists and bandits. I think you could make an argument that they're more chill just in the sense that they have bigger problems than dealing with the Salt Alliance these days, that and they might even be willing to work with them to deal with like an actual monstrous threat or incursion, but they still view the Salt Alliance as fundamentally traitors.
Interesting. Next up would be the Forsaken.
The Forsaken are just absolutely blasphemous to the Knights of Redemption. The Forsaken, as we've mentioned before, believe that the gods are either dead or have left us, and that this is actually a good thing, that this provides us with more freedom to choose our own path and forge our own future. And this is just kind of antithetical to the beliefs of the Knights of Redemption, who still worship the old gods, even if they haven't heard from them in a long time, and believe that through devoutly sort of clinging to these old ways, that the gods will eventually smile upon them again in return if they are good enough, essentially.
Finally, we have the Fifth Legion, which is another sort of group competing for this title of continuation of the old Atnian government. So how does that work out?
Yeah, I think these are two of the only groups since the apocalypse that have actually already engaged in a small conflict and war over basically some of the lands on the outside of Pax Nova. I don't think that war was very long or like went anywhere, but there's already conflict between these two groups. There are also attempts between the two of them to sort of meet and treat with one another, as they're kind of two different military factions from the old government that have similar goals, right? To start reclaiming the land of Atnia and eventually to reclaim the original city of Pax. I think both groups kind of have that same goal, but they both claim to be sort of the legitimate remaining government, and different pressures sort of push them into conflict with one another. So they are almost like 50-50 in whether they'd end up being close allies at some point in the future or almost the most bitter enemies as they're sort of fighting over the same claims and resources.
Do you want to talk about any other minor factions that they might be dealing with before I have something to say about Pax?
No, I think the Pale Mages and the cult of the Pale Sun is like less influential for Pax Nova right now because it exists on this far side of the world in terms of how they'd interact. But they'd also probably view it as a cult kind of worshipping a blasphemous god if they were to encounter it.
I see. And as mentioned with the 5th Legion, kind of the grand goal of these factions that are looking to reinstate the Atnian kingdom perhaps in a new image is to retake the capital city existing within the center of Atnia, which is Pax. Now, the thing about Atnia right now is post-apocalypse, the more you go towards into this central valley, the more dangerous it is, the more arcane magic there is, the more random monsters are roaming around. And the central capital city of Pax, which is not to be confused with Pax Nova to be clear, is effectively frozen in time. There's kind of been mid-destruction, it's completely frozen. If you look towards the center of the valley, you'll see this kind of central clock tower of Pax split in half and just floating in the sky. So it's kind of unclear how exactly they're going to be able to retake Pax, but they're sort of slowly building towards that goal.
Yeah, and no one is really sure what's going on actually inside the city. That you see this frozen clock tower suspended in the sky, but before the apocalypse, Pax was already the most heavily sort of guarded city in the Empire. It was really hard to get there without an official legal pass, and some of the laws in Atnia, these magically enforced laws created by Pyrrhus's law magic and enforced by the Arbiters, are still intact. So, to anyone's knowledge, no one since the apocalypse has actually been able to get in or out of the city of Pax. And so that's still a major goal, but there are hurdles to it that people aren't even aware of yet.
Interesting. And next episode, we will be going a little bit more in depth on Pyrrhus, who is the old Archmage of Atnia. And that might shed some more light on Pax to some people. And that will be going through some of the pre-apocalypse history as well. So stay tuned for that. And thanks for watching.
I swear to tend the fields I call home for as long as I can work a plough. However lofty my renown, I will not forget my roots. I will raise my sword to defend my neighbor and my home and live my days in noble humility. Except in times of great need, I will never forsake my shovel for the sword. The oath of a knight from the Order of Wheat.